It's become clear that people in this country and globally have been steamrolled. It is also clear that it has been coordinated globally. It is also clear that it has been integrated, not just over 6 months, not just over 2.5 years, but it has been planned over decades. The changes to legislation in this country were done so that they could control doctors and people. But the people are waking, and it's thanks to people like Dr. Altman and all the presenters here today, thanks to people like Senator Babette and Craig Kelly. We know and we knew that this is all bullshit and that we've been had. But we are going to hound you down, the people that are guilty. We are going to hound you down and hold you accountable, and we will expose your global agenda so that the people of Australia can be free in the future. Because I love my kids, and I'm looking forward to my grandkids. And we are going to save this country.
Hi, I'm Dr. Philip McMillan. Thank you for joining me for, again, a very important interview presentation with people across the world. There's been a lot of attention on New Zealand recently with regards to Barry Young and the leaking of information from the Ministry of Health. But we need to understand a little bit more about New Zealand, how they think, and talk to people who are actually on the ground. Now, you have to remember that Barry Young represents one voice who is challenging the narrative, but I have the tremendous opportunity to speak to one of the other voices that challenges the narrative, and he's part of a group and an organization. So today I want to understand a little bit more about him. I want to understand a little bit more about his thoughts as to what has been happening in New Zealand, and most importantly, where is it that we can go in terms of the future? Because here is the reality. New Zealand is very unusual, and it's unusual because they technically had zero COVID. So they were able to vaccinate their population prior to COVID spreading throughout. There are a lot of scientific learnings that we can have from that. And I'd always thought the data from New Zealand and parts of Australia represent an extremely valuable piece of science that we really, really need to get access to. So let's start with some simple things, and let's introduce Dr. Matt Sheldon from NZDSOS in Wellington, New Zealand. Thank you very much, Matt, for joining us. The first thing I'll ask you to do is just give a quick introduction and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Hi, Philip. Hey, thanks very much for having me here. So I've been a doctor for 38 years. I was trained in the UK, and I've spent about half of my working life, actually no, more than half of my actual life in New Zealand now. Actually, I came here in '94. So I've been in practice here since then, predominantly in primary care, general practice. But about the last half of that time in more integrative medicine. So I've had a combined conventional and integrative practice here in Wellington from 2010 until an ignominious exit in 2021 from my practice. So I was suspended by the Medical Council for communicating some of my thoughts on informed consent and the need for proper due diligence over the vaccine to my patients. In November, I was suspended, and three of us have all won our rights. Well, we appealed against the suspension, and we've all won in the district court. And we, we're part of a group. Well, I'm part of a group now. We've got well over 200 people, over 250 now. Most of those are doctors who, are occupying very solid moral high ground, we feel, in holding out and advocating for long tried and trusted principles of human rights. It's not just about ethical medicine, but the right to full, free, unforced informed consent, the right to bodily autonomy, the precautionary principle, the importance of protecting children and pregnant women and women of childbearing age from any untoward harm. These things are our absolute sort of gold standards as they were for all doctors until this COVID era. So that's a sort of basic introduction to who I am. So I'm working pretty much full time with NZDSOS to try and just keep getting these messages out, and we're asking a lot of questions, and we're running projects and trying to support vaccine injured people and advocate for families that have lost loved ones in uncertain circumstances, shall we say. But I need to also just say at this stage that I'm not actually a practicing doctor. I don't have a practicing certificate. The Medical Council moved to resuspend me as soon as I won my appeal, and my annual practicing certificate lapsed during that time anyway. So it actually suits me to not be a suspended doctor, and I've got plenty of things to do anyway. I just don't work as a doctor, and I'm certainly not here to diagnose anybody or make medical treatments. But I am entitled to my own views, which are hard won and based on thousands of hours now of my own research and education. But I'm not standing here as a practicing medical doctor at the moment.
I understand that, Matt, and I appreciate that stance. And part of what I try and do first is understand people. Now, clearly, you've taken an angle that many other clinicians don't do, because you've gone down the integrative route of medicine. What made you do that? What made you take that transition away from the standard allopathic route?
That's a really good question, and probably a number of influences, but it's certainly been an evolutionary journey rather than a sort of road to Damascus, blinding flash of light at one stage. I never really felt comfortable in my own skin as a conventional GP. I was frustrated with managing chronic disease in that we never could really get to the heart of why people were sick. There were certain questions I'd always had, certain things that never made sense to me, and I always thought maybe I was just thick, and perhaps I am. Plenty of people have said that to me actually, but understanding the causes of illness, and that not everybody's medical label or diagnosis has the same underlying causes, it eventually led me to think, well, I ought to know something about nutrition, surely, because people are only as good as the building blocks they're using to construct themselves. And I bought a book, a secondhand book actually, and I opened it, and it was full of biochemical pathways and pictures of plants and cavemen, and all these lights started going on. And I understood that actually there was so much stuff that had either we'd never been taught at medical school, or we were taught without understanding its relevance. But there, it's all about much of it is about chemistry and the building blocks that we use, and the hand that the body's dealt, it will play as best it can, but when it can't, you can get signs and symptoms of disease. So that began a process of my own education and learning, and ultimately teaching too at a sort of postgraduate level in nutritional medicine and environmental medicine, that completely freed up my thinking and helped me become a much better doctor, I think.
Wow. So listen, when we come to the crux of the matter with regards to COVID-19, so when the pandemic hit in 2019 into 2020, and it was starting to circulate across the world, what was your instinct at that time?
Well, I paid a lot of attention during the swine flu epidemic in 2008. Because working through it, it was very clear immediately to me when the virus hit. I can remember a Monday morning in July, and 12 out of 14 patients in the morning all had identical symptoms, but they were all sitting in the waiting room, feeling fairly miserable, most of them. So it was clearly an influenza type illness. But the point is, they were in the waiting room. I wasn't going out to their houses, which with your classic really unpleasant influenza. You know what that feels like. You just want to die and you can't get out of bed. So although it was very infectious, seemed more infectious and easier to catch than other influenzas that I've worked through, and many of my colleagues have worked through in their careers, it wasn't a severe clinical illness, but there was this real push and excitement around vaccination. And in the end, the swine flu came and went. and the vaccine proved to be harmful, and there were a number of deaths, and several hundred British school children, or school-aged children, got a sort of epileptic disorder called narcolepsy. And in the wake of that, the European Commission did an investigation, and they came out very, very critical of the WHO and Big Pharma for using it to manipulate people's fear and to justify rolling out a vaccine before it was ready. And that always stuck in my mind, and I immediately wondered, are we looking at the same thing here? Because although initially it looked very frightening, very quickly, as data came out, it proved actually to be just another medium influenza level sort of severity type virus that would probably come and go if left to do its own thing.
So at the time, New Zealand took the bold step of literally closing down its borders, preventing COVID from getting in. And they did this quite successfully by preventing almost a zero COVID strategy, like what happened in China and to some extent in Australia. So at the time, did you think that was the right way to go, or would you, as they say, have let it rip?
Oh, look, very early on, I was just as vulnerable to some of what we were seeing and hearing, I suppose, as other people. In fact, there was a petition put around by some doctors to the Prime Minister to actually close the borders from, this wasn't to lock the country down, but to close the borders from overseas visitors while we were gaining more information and to buy us time to understand the actual severity. And I put my name to that. But within a few weeks, we had the John Ioannidis, a statistician, and the WHO itself talking about the IFR, the infection fatality rate, being much lower than we were initially told and frightened with. And one of the first interviews I did actually was with John Campbell in probably March 2020. So we were already in our lockdown. And he and I both agreed that any vaccine would be years off, and how long would we keep ourselves locked down and locked in, and sort of cut off from the world. But the conversation locally here was very much about, well, a vaccine will come, and we may have to do this until a vaccine is here. And we were thinking, well, that's crazy. It takes 5 to 10 years to develop a safe and proven vaccine. Are we going to sit here in lockdown? But I think that the initial strategy of preventing people coming in from countries that may be harboring what could have been a very dangerous virus was the correct one. But they should have revised that very quickly, because there was new information, and it was the ignoring of that got sort of our attention. Certainly.
So as I move through, because I'm just taking us through the steps here, it's quite fascinating to hear the perspectives. So you then go through all of 2020 in a lockdown, which I understand your perspective on now. But then they did make the decision to do the lockdown in New Zealand. It was zero COVID. Now the vaccine comes on board, and there is great excitement across the world because the initial studies are showing that this vaccine looks tremendous. It's produced in a short period of time, new technology, great outcomes. What were your thoughts at that point when the initial data started to come in about the success of at least the Pfizer? That was number one that got onto the market.
Well, by this point, we'd already had some curious things that had happened here. The most obvious one was that hydroxychloroquine, about which there was some very exciting and seemingly, high-level data coming out from real-world use. They were taken off the shelves, as was Artemisia, which is a very popular and sort of sought after natural health product in, say, natural approaches to cancer, etc. And it's also an anti-parasite, and again, a WHO recommended essential medicine for chloroquine-resistant malaria. So, that had raised eyebrows, to put it mildly. But also being in a lockdown here and not having COVID, and having really, empty waiting rooms and doing a few phone consults and things. We had lots and lots of time to look at what was going on in the literature and what doctors who were working with COVID were finding helpful and what they were saying. So, we were starting to think in terms of early treatments, and that actually when COVID did come here, we'd be better placed. And then there was this huge splash around this sort of 95% effective thing. And because we were already, we had other sources of information that we'd sort of found and learned to trust and listen to. Other people did the maths and said, look, there's a big difference between the relative effectiveness and the absolute reduction in cases. And if you do the numbers, it's not nearly as good as Pfizer is saying. And I'd taught lectures on interpreting clinical trials and the difference between absolute reduction and relative reduction, and the numbers needed to treat and the numbers needed to vaccinate, to prevent a case and things. So we were very skeptical straight away, and we sort of organised ourselves in the sort of subsequent few months. And in fact, we're writing to government before the vaccine rollout started here with exactly those concerns. But the marketing of safe and effective, and frankly, if you're saying something's 95% effective, that's as good as saying it's 100% effective. But nobody was talking about preventing transmission. I mean, we were asking questions, and effective at what? But the assumption was that everybody had going into it is that they wouldn't get COVID if they took the jab. And in fact, on a famous occasion during Delta, our Prime Minister stared at the camera and said exactly that. If you get vaccinated, you won't get or die from Delta.
Yeah, those are some big statements. And I suspect that it has been said, and I had to reflect carefully on it, is that when they were making those statements, the companies would have known those statements were not accurate. And even though they weren't making the statements, did they have a responsibility to correct those statements and to say, actually, that is not what the study was looking at. We were looking at severity of disease, not transmission of disease. So those are some very important points that should have been brought out. But I want to go back to something that you'd said with regards to early treatment, because the interesting thing in the context of New Zealand is that it would never have been applicable because you didn't have COVID. How did that thought work with regards to early treatment as opposed to other parts of the world where they were having COVID spreading through?
Well, I think we all thought that, we knew we'd get COVID at some point. The borders would be opened up, and we were looking at other countries, going through it. And we thought, look, our time will come probably. And some of us were dubious by asking questions that were completely ignored and certainly not answered around transmission and what sort of immunity would we get, because it was clear that the clinical trials were really only about reducing symptoms. So we knew that the country would have to be opened up, and our personal sort of lockdowns, in-home lockdowns were 6 weeks or something the first time round, and then we sort of got our lives back relatively, and then there was great excitement and preparations for the vaccine rollout, and we were all told constantly that this would be the salvation, and we would be able to travel and see our families and things because of the miracle of the vaccine. We just had to basically get in behind it and all support it. And, there is nothing wrong with that. If you're given that information plainly, you're not going to rock the boat. But we all knew that the information was lies. And your question about, or your point about, that we should trust what we're told, the major responsibility that drug companies feel is to their shareholders. And in fact, in law, they're much more culpable if they do something that might reduce their bottom line than tell the truth and look after patients. And there's a trail of huge fines that the drug companies have racked up, and Pfizer has the biggest single record fine in the world. So these people don't have a great track record, for sure. And part of learning, your own trade as an integrative medicine person is understanding the limitations and the behavior that's made you question and got you there in the first place. So it's all public domain information, that we shouldn't necessarily take what they say on face value. And I'm trying to be as generous as I can in the way I say this.
So when did you start to get in trouble from the perspective of going against that narrative? When did that start to happen for you?
I mean, as far as the regulators, because
Yeah.
I mean, I was already struggling with my own thoughts and feelings around this, and starting to see. I thought I was seeing vaccine side effects quite early on in elderly people, and some of the my own patients who were border workers and frontline workers and things, and just the sheer speed at which this thing had appeared was very, very concerning. And I personally was smelling a rat by the time the first people got vaccinated here, because I'd seen the extreme reporting of side effects and deaths in other countries that were already doing their rollouts, that was off the charts, literally, and like nothing else that had gone before. But I felt I had a responsibility to my patients who are what's called capitated. So if you work as a standard GP in this country, you have a contract with the government to provide primary care, and you receive a sort of base funding for that, to provide those services. And then there's a sort of a top up that patients pay depending on various factors. So I had a number of patients that were bound to me, and I had an obligation to provide medical care, but also to give my perspectives, and to fill in what was a huge gap in knowledge and information that I thought was required in order for people to make good, careful decisions. And we knew with certainty that COVID wasn't nearly as bad as we were all led to believe in the beginning. But we'd had a year being conditioned, I suppose, to think that our function going forward as GPs was to be heroic swabbers, swab everything that moved, and to jab everybody, rather than actually doing what we've always done when faced with symptomatic health problems, which is to treat with the treatments that we have, to use our knowledge and our because there's a lot of art in medicine too, and you choose the right medicine, the right treatment for the right people. But there was a lot of science confirming the value of hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin that had been taken off the table too. So all of these things actually made me, really quite alarmed about what might be coming. And so I sent a message to the bulk of my patients that were under 50 and who had children, just saying, look, I think, you really need to do your own due diligence here, and that there is another source of information. And I put our website address in a text that I sent out. And that's really what got me into trouble.
So let me just understand this in terms of timelines, because New Zealand didn't actually kind of open the border and get the surge of Omicron until about early 2022. But they had done the job of vaccinating a vast proportion of the population, I think up to 80%, prior to that point. So in the context of that time frame when there wasn't any COVID and everybody was getting vaccinated and being pushed, what was your personal stance with that? Because they must have brought in the mandates as well in 2021.
Yeah, well, the very first mandate was the one issued by the Medical Council, actually, to doctors, saying, we expect you to be vaccinated, and you must only promote the benefits of vaccination. So our New Zealand Medical Council put out this guidance statement, as it was known, to doctors in March or April 2021. And so that's when our vaccination campaign started. And we did actually have COVID in 2021. And as in many countries, the cases sort of ramped up really after the vaccination campaign started, and tracked really with the waves of vaccination, the first and the second, and things. So, you know, we were sort of ready for that, I guess. But the continued arbiter against anybody who was talking about using early treatments, and already then the attacks on people who were, you know, conscientiously putting out information and trying to warn people that, look, there is another side of the story, and that, you know, the immune system is incredibly delicate and complex, and we actually just don't know. You know, there are some big questions that have been unanswered, and we don't know what might happen in the future. You know, there was an imperative for all of us that we all shared, to really try and get people's attention, by sort of speaking out, so that the trouble and the pushback, you know, ramped up on us, as we became more visible and vocal.
And so what about your own colleagues? Because it's one thing to get pushback from the government and from the council and so on, but in your day-to-day interactions, because you took a stance in terms of you didn't want to get vaccinated, did you?
Oh, I
How?
was never going to do this. I was never going to take the vaccine personally, for sure, because it was just so, well, it was very unexpected, when it did appear so quickly, but also very, very suspicious. There's no way in a million years that this thing wasn't already ready somehow, or being worked up. You know, you couldn't get $1 billion doses or more, of these vaccines ready in this sort of the short time. And you know, we were thinking back and reviewing the conversations that were going on in the media, you know, in early 2020, actually setting us up and sort of readying the whole vaccine debate, and getting people kind of conditioned to the idea that there would be a vaccine and that it would happen very quick. And then we had the whole, you know, Operation Warp Speed. So, you know, it was very clear that there was something, you know, really, really dodgy going on, to us anyway, by then. And we did have COVID in 2021. And again, like other countries experience, it was clear that in most people, it was really, you know, a mild or moderate illness, or in fact, they had no symptoms at all, because we were all told if you tested positive, you were infectious to other people, even if you had no symptoms. You know, and that should have been a new thing. So my colleagues, in sort of conventional medicine, well, really, I lost contact with most of them when I had to leave my job. The government just sort of tore up my contract, to provide care to the patients, and so that was my business taken away, essentially, because I had nothing to sell, onto somebody else. But I know that a lot of people that I previously, you know, knew and talked to had some reservations privately, but felt that the imperative to just get in behind and follow the narrative, and present a unified front, so that patients were reassured, and not any more frightened than they had already been made to be, seemed to be the imperative for many people. You know, for other doctors, there's no doubt that they bought the whole thing, and you know, still can't understand why people like us, you know, are bellyaching about, you know, informed consent and lack of safety testing and all the unknowns in the future and things, because COVID was clearly the worst thing that has ever happened in their careers, and that's their experience. And so it's very hard to, you know, dismantle somebody's perspective, in a sort of short time. And when they saw the steps that were taken against me and my colleagues for, you know, asking questions or speaking out, that's another disincentive, I guess, to, you know, join the fray. And it's always easier to be part of a majority than a minority, you know, who were labelled, using the full force of the government's propaganda machine, as crazy anti-vaxxers and conspiracy theorists, etc. You know, why would you want to have the same, you know, berating in the media and belittlement and things? But we're still here, and we're getting stronger, and time is moving on, Philip.
Yeah, and so I'm digging into something here, because I don't know if people grasp the significance of this. You effectively gave up your practice of medicine on a stance that for many other people, they would say, you know what, I may not believe it, but guess what? I'm not going to stop practicing. I'll just take it. What made you take that really strong stance?
Yeah, well, I didn't voluntarily give it up. I mean, it was taken away from me, but we knew that the vaccine had been improved for children, and we put a campaign out. It was going to be rolled out in schools initially, so we wrote to schools and we tried to say, look, you don't have the legal immunity that the government's telling you do if things go wrong, and it's not as straightforward as the government is saying. And a number of high-profile schools that had volunteered to be part of the initial um, festival atmosphere of the sort of the rollout into schools actually pulled out. And we knew that the government would try and come up with something else. And my personal bottom line was always that if they approved, well, they'd approved it, but if they started actually vaccinating children, that was unconscionable to me. And I just didn't think that I could continue being part of the system. So Jacinda Ardern, who was the Prime Minister then, suddenly announced on a Thursday in August that from the following day, children would be able to be vaccinated at the community vaccine centres. Now, this was news to them as well. They hadn't been told either. They weren't prepared, suddenly for 12-year-olds and upwards all to be coming in for their jabs. But I just knew that was this was going to be my personal Waterloo, and I needed to tell patients who we weren't getting a chance, of course, to have a nuanced, tailored individual consultation with about this vaccination, because the first we knew that they'd been vaccinated, we'd just be getting something coming into our inbox, a notice of vaccination. But it wouldn't even come in like other jabs, flu jabs and things like that. If somebody's had a flu jab somewhere else or at work, we would have to see that. This was going directly into the patient file. So, we didn't know which of our patients were being vaccinated where and when, and we'd only find out after the fact if we had the patient in front of us, then in fact they'd received a first or second COVID jab. So, that night I sent a text out, and I made a bit of a technical error, it seems, and some patients who hadn't been my patient for quite a long time received a text from a doctor that they might not have even remembered. And a couple of these people had been vaccinated, and understandably felt very upset, and to get this unsolicited message from somebody that wasn't in a sort of doctor relationship with them anymore, and somebody rang the papers or complained to the medical council. So by the next day, it was already clear to me I was in deep doo-doo. I knew I'd get in trouble, and I knew the medical council would have a lot to say, but I didn't think things would happen quite so quickly. And so my contract was terminated, and I left work a couple of days later. But I certainly wasn't going to get the vaccine myself, and a number of my colleagues said the same thing. But the pressure in the end, and to keep providing a service which I fully respect, decided to actually get vaccinated themselves. So that's really how it played out.
I want people to understand something, is that for someone who has practiced medicine for 38 years, has been directly involved in patient care, to have that taken away from you is actually very, very difficult. It is traumatic because it takes a part of you that has become a way of bringing value into the lives of others. And so I'm saying this because I don't want people to underestimate what sacrifice that was that you did. I know from a clinical perspective that was a huge sacrifice. And as you said, your Waterloo was children. You thought that they had definitely gone too far with that.
Yes, and pregnancy. There are golden rules. You and I, Philip, know in medicine there are golden rules that we learn that you learn to break. Every specialty and things has them, except we have not risked any medication that isn't absolutely essential in pregnancy, for instance. People are told, look, don't even take a Panadol if you can avoid it, and you certainly must try not to drink alcohol and don't smoke. And yet here we are still saying this thing is safe and effective in all stages in pregnancy. and we knew very, very clearly that COVID wasn't a risk to children. So there was only one clear course that we could take, and that I could take certainly, and that was to give my professional opinion, to patients who expected or required it from me. Many of them didn't like what they heard, sure, but I still had a duty and responsibility to get that information to them. Now, the government have been saying, look, we are the one source of truth, and you can go to our website, and there was a very narrow range of studies that people could look at, largely from the CDC, which was small and not necessarily peer reviewed, and sort of cherry picking. And we've been accused of the same thing, of course, but in the context of this brand new platform that was already known, in the other ways that it was used in cancer therapy and things, to come with real stings in the tail for some people. We just, well, it's still beyond belief, actually, that people were subjected to this sort of campaign of propaganda and very narrow information delivered with such confidence, in a way that was deliberately designed to make people believe that there was no doubt, it was 100%. They didn't need to think for themselves, and that anybody that gave a different view was crazy or should be struck off. And when the machine winds up and gets to work on you, it's quite a force to sort of see, what the state can do. But amazingly, lots of people thought for themselves, and we're not just a few very limited, crazy people screaming into the wind. And you saw the extent of pushback against the mandates. Even people who were vaccinated, and who felt fine about it, still turned up in Wellington to protest this, totalitarian attempt to take over control of people's bodies and to remove their livelihoods, if they didn't take an injection. So it will stand in history, I think, as being an exercise in the mass manipulation of all sorts of people, including highly trained professionals in all areas, and certainly my colleagues who have been trained in choosing from a very limited range of medications, and as we all know, if you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and I think we've fallen into a huge trap, and the really important bit, of course, is digging ourselves out of it. And
So
for
let
me
me
now,
let
the
me
next
ask.
challenge is seeing how we can rescue medicine.
Yeah, so this is the question I want to ask you, Matt. When you pull back and look at it, and now you are actually looking at it independently, has the medical profession failed the patients?
Undoubtedly, I'm sorry, that's yes, in many ways. But the key thing that I think that hurts the most is, in medicine, there's a fundamental power imbalance. You have the doctor with all the knowledge and the ability to potentially save your life, and the patient who may be in pain or frightened or scared, very disempowered. It's not like going into a shop and buying something from a salesman. This is very different. So implicit in that is this, what's called the fiduciary obligation, which recognizes that there is an extra duty on doctors to provide information and to guide the patient and to fully inform, because of everything that we do, all our treatments, they're interventions. We're doing something that changes the body in some way. All drugs are toxic, actually. Even the effects you want are caused by an interruption in biochemistry. You're changing something about the way the body works. And so that brings with it an implicit danger. But we also have this extra authority that is vested in us by people because they're scared, or we have the ability to reassure them or remove anxiety. And I think that we've misused that And that power that we've had has kind of been weaponized against us. And so that authority has come in behind the recommendation to vaccinate. And it's been corrupted. And I think, many doctors have just not understood what's been done to them and how they've been used, for political and behind politics. Politics, of course, you've always got economics and finance and very clearly corporations. And I think we've been hoodwinked. And I think we do have to start the process of retaking control of what happens in the consultation room and yeah, mostly in the consultation room, really. I mean, if you're hit by a bus, you need a hospital, and you need high-tech medicine and life-saving drugs, etc. But most of what's gone on has required GP land essentially to get in behind and not rock the boat. And I think that year that we had, while we were sitting quaking in our boots as to what was going to happen, and the salvation of the vaccine, which helped remove a lot of people's anxiety, falsely, of course, because it doesn't seem like it works, and that's to be generous. Did us a lot of harm, and I think we're going to dig ourselves out of that, with some difficulty.
So you will understand how medics think, and and understand the ego that exists around medicine. Medics don't like to acknowledge when they're wrong, even when they know they're wrong. How will the medical community ever do that transition? And you can see, even with all the data coming out and even with all the issues, there is still an implicit belief that the science has got to work. How do they get out of that?
Look, the same way I think everybody is going to transition out of this, and that is to recognize and understand that they were played, that they were tricked, and that our human psychology was used against us in a very, very effective way. Ways we still don't probably understand, but there's lots of stuff already out there. People have just got to pick up a book, Laura Dodsworth's book, State of Fear, I think it was called, and start reading for themselves and thinking for themselves again. And I think they'll understand that, the echo chamber that they thought they were in, the more, the sort of intellectual superiority and the pro kind of, political narrative stance, that made them feel that they were right simply because so many people bought into it. They can all move themselves and say, yes, I'm a good person. I want to help my patients. I've done my best all the way through this, but I was given false information. And now that I look at this other information and I understand the forces that were arraigned against me, to actually understand fully what was the right thing to do. Now we see those for what they are. And as we gradually dismantle those, we can start to pick up the pieces and clean up the mess. But we're going to have some brave and difficult conversations and go back to basically ethics 101 and remember the oaths that we took in public, weren't just words, they were highly symbolic of a conduct that should keep us, safe and effective all the way through our careers as best as that's possible.
And it brings us to one of the central issues that is been circulating around the world. And it's that point about what Barry Young did when he released this information to the general public, apparently anonymized and so on, but with some issues for which really caused a lot of outrage in New Zealand because it was a breach of patient confidentiality. But tell me what your thoughts are about what happened there or is happening there.
Well, it certainly made a splash, and whatever the facts of the thing are, I think it's really great that there's lots of eyes on what's going on in New Zealand. And the most telling thing actually isn't so much about Barry with the data, but the response of the government that moved immediately to, they got an injunction from a fairly low court, actually the Employment Relations Authority, and it's very unclear, who's actually targeted by that, and on what basis it was issued, and what information was given to the court actually to let it out. But Barry, of course, was arrested. But even worse than that, some sort of cyber SAS kind of campaign then set out to, remove this data from people's hard drives, along with a lot of their own other, information and data. Perhaps the best known example being McKernan's stuff, and of course he's done huge amounts of work proving contamination, beyond any need to argue actually, and it's been validated, of course, and repeated by Philip Buckholt and other people. So, orders were sort of sent out to chase this information down and retrieve it, and bring it home and put it back under guard. But it was already anonymized, so there wasn't a threat to privacy anyway when he released it. And from what we understand, he spent quite a bit of time working on this. And in fact, he's been known of for a year or so. We knew that there was a whistleblower or somebody who was, didn't know what to do. They felt they were trapped in a they were privy to information that showed harm, and they didn't know what to do. And I think he seems like he finally got across the line. And I think the guy's who he says he is, and I haven't met him or spoken to him, but I think he's got integrity, and I think he's the real deal. He's not a statistician for sure. He's administered a database, and the information is not the full record of everybody who's had every jab by any means. And I think that's upset and disappointed a number of people who are waiting, with bated breath, I think, for perhaps the final, the final shoe to fall. This is it. It all ends now because we've got, all the proof we'll need that a government's hiding, hiding the harms. And the information adds to that canon of knowledge that we already have, the other releases from, the Medicare data in the States, and from your own ONS data that people like Norman Fenton have been, all over and interpreting for us. It's not like we didn't already have plenty of evidence on every level, proving the harms. So I think there's been some disappointment, and I think there's a sort of freedom movement, kind of academia or sort of intelligentsia that is also desperate for all this to be over, and we want to get world-changing proof that will work for everybody, so all this can be over, who have been terrified of being trapped or tricked, or taken down a rabbit hole. So I think we have to keep it in context. It's a limited release, but of real government data, and they've behaved in a very, I would say, I suppose, predictable. It's slightly disappointing because we've got a new government, and there's certainly some promise for some lights to be shone and some disclosure. And a lot of the non-COVID and non-medical sort of legislative nonsense that's been pushed on us in the last 3 years too, almost behind the smokescreen of COVID. There's promises to repeal some of that. So I think there's lots of reasons for optimism. But I really admire Barry, and I'm very very proud of what he's done. And I think we just need to keep cool heads and just recognize that it's not his fault that we're all stressed and traumatized by what's gone on in the last few years, and that he hasn't spoon-fed us an entire set of data that we can all agree on. But it adds to what we already know and what we've been saying certainly for nearly 3 years now, which is there is strong evidence of harm. Any benefits have obviously been overplayed and oversold, and it has to stop now.
It's actually quite frightening to contemplate that the options here are very small. It's either regulators haven't been looking at data, or they have looked at it and not understood the data, or they have identified problems and suppressed the data. Any one of those options is horrific. And so I can see that in the midst of the challenge to what he did, if it does come out, and this is where I feel very strongly, if it does come out that there was evidence of harm in New Zealand, which was what I consider the prototype of vaccine testing, which was suppressed, then heads should roll. I can't see any way that was probably the most important data that the world would need to see. And if that data had been suppressed and potential harm, if it was occurring, was not shown, I mean, it's frightening to conceive that people would do that.
Yeah, I think all of those three possibilities that you mentioned have been operating on various levels with various people at different times. But the unifying theme right from the beginning, in our experience, has been the complete silence and the refusal to engage, with very limited exceptions. At the beginning, we did get somewhat of a conversation with a sort of chief medical advisor to the government, but they sort of disengaged really. And as the real world consequences of the vaccine harms, the sudden deaths, the unexpected deaths, and not just in the young people. And we talk a lot about the young, obviously, in the children, because that's where it's most dramatic, and where the rise in all-cause mortality, which is across the board in all age groups, I guess is the hardest to dismiss or explain. But actually, the elderly, have been hit particularly hard, and this is what Barry's data was more concerned with. He was running a payment system for mobile clinics that were going into places, but also I think running pop-ups and things, rather than where most vaccinations occurred, which is probably in pharmacies and general practices that were running it themselves. But it's very hard to get your head around the behaviours that you've surmised must have been happening, but plainly they were. And again, I think many of these regulators, certainly the sort of the middle and lower level people involved in facilitating the rollout and approving everything, have just been shown to be very human and playable. And there was a point, I'm sure, well, we know there was a point where the government was clearly aware of the harms. They were acknowledged and discussed internally, all while we were all still being told, look, safe and effective and nothing to see here, and anybody that says otherwise is crazy and an anti-vax nutter, etc. But the people at the top are responsible, and they were privy to not just what was their own surveillance mechanism should have told them, and what we were telling them and submitting regularly, but what was going on in other countries too, because their responses and their kind of propaganda, plainly there was a sort of a lockstep, coordinated playbook that was being followed, and so a lot of what we've dealt with in New Zealand, we think has really come from elsewhere, and we want to know who and where, as well as why, I guess. That's all happened, and that's what we're hoping one of our projects, if you like, which is pushing back against the medical council and trying to discover in court exactly what communications have gone on and what coordination has gone on around the world, to certainly remove us as doctors here in New Zealand from having any sort of influence and conversation with our patients.
And so when we reflect, as we're coming here towards the end, Matt, and I believe that the world needs to transition where we recognize and listen to those who are willing to sacrifice to bring the best for the world. And in that sense, I consider you one of them. And so where does health and medicine go from here? Because this is an absolute disaster that we're going to have to overcome. How do we do that?
Look, I don't know. It's a huge question. We'll all get involved in trying, but for healing to happen, and for sort of, piecing together what's gone on, there has to be truth and transparency. And I believe genuinely that many of my colleagues, aren't criminal, aren't destructive. They have been tricked. They have been fed false information, and encouraged not to look for themselves, not to think for themselves. And medicine's like any other profession. You go along to get along, and you don't really question your elders, and there's a sort of consensus. And the power in medicine, of course, also is in the knowledge that we all have that that we're all supposed to agree on. So anybody that asks questions is always looking for trouble, I guess. But we're always going to need doctors, and we've got loads. And I think that we need better leadership, and we need a different model for regulating us and overseeing us. And I think there needs to be much more participation on the ground. And I think this is true also of our whole structure of governance and our whole political system. We need to regain the power and influence at the level of the ground into how our lives are structured and how we behave and how as doctors we work. And that, of course, means shining a light and getting rid of the malign influence of huge money behind the scenes. And I'm talking about big pharma, of course, and corporations that have immense lobbying power and almost infinite marketing budgets. And people have been calling this out, for many years. It's almost not a joke, but every single top tier medical journal editor that leaves, the first thing they do is they write a book, or they declare actually how corrupted the medical journal system is, and how hard it is to discern what's actually true and what's completely fake. And there are influences at every level of medicine, from your first day at medical school, all the way through to the day you retire. Actually, there's big money maintaining massive markets, and with no intention of actually moving us towards real health and wellness. So I think the integrative model has a lot to offer, and the journey that many of us have been through to this different understanding of what's required is a model that we sometimes have to try and accelerate many of our colleagues through. But it's going to be much harder for them because they've got a much shorter time to sort of have to get their head around differences in the way to think, and perhaps the way that they've been, certain things have been hidden or left out of their teaching. So it's going to be tough, but I think the benefits are huge, and I think we're going to be a better planet for this very difficult time, and with some more difficult times perhaps to come. But I don't think we have a choice, and I think most people are in medicine for the right reasons, and I think we can heal together, but we need a public process of discovery and accountability that everybody is going to benefit from, not just from doctors. And we're hopeful that we might be able to start that process or lead it a bit from New Zealand.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much, Matt. And just to emphasize to people, here we have someone who had a belief, who had a stance. He was willing to sacrifice everything for what he believed is right. I think that's the foundation of medicine. I think that is the kind of leadership that we need in medicine. And I would hope, Matt, that in a new world, in a new place where medicine is trying to heal and to fix the wrongs, that we bring those people who have demonstrated the true integrity of doing everything that they can on behalf of their patients. I think that you're a tremendous example of that. I think Barry Young is another one. And so two people from New Zealand who have stood, drawn a line and said, I will not go beyond this. So we appreciate that. We are inspired by it. And we hope that it inspires others as well. So thank you very much, Matt. And Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk on behalf of actually many other people, who found themselves in the same position as me. We're just going to, as long as we're upright and breathing, we will keep pushing on, trying to discern what the truth is and putting it out there. So thanks for the talk.
Wonderful. Thank you. Just hang there while I do the outro. Have a great evening, everyone, and we'll continue to keep you updated on news, COVID across the world. Thank you.